Hello and welcome. I'm Alex Proimos, Head of Institutional Content and Investment Magazine, and this is Market Narratives. This show is a series of unorthodox conversations with thought leaders influencing the world of fiduciary investors. For more related insights and analysis, please remember to check out our website, investmentmagazine.com.au, and subscribe for a free email. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. My guest today is Michael Swinsburg, Managing Partner Asia Pac at Alexander Hughes. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be with you today. Thanks for the opportunity.
It's okay. I thought today we would start with the reflections on the superannuation guarantee. We were almost at 30 years. Maybe your early reflections, given your time in the industry.
Well, look, time in the industry. Those that know me know I started in sort of wealth and asset management in the late 80s. Come through that, places like Macquarie and Citibank and Prudential, into the late 90s, moving into executive search. So the last couple of decades, I've been working with leaders across the sector and really enjoying that, both placing them and advising and leadership advisory. So that's very briefly my 30-year background, which coincides a lot with SG. And what I've tried to write in an article I know you're going to publish shortly is that I've been sitting back in this COVID reflective time, working from home like everybody else, and thinking, gee, I've gone over 30, Super's hitting 30, Super's longer than 30, it's just SG Super that's 30, coming up to 30 in 2022. Super's been around a lot longer than that. Corporate Super and 3% Super was around in the 80s. But we've done a fantastic job, but I think a lot of us beat ourselves up, particularly after the Royal Commission and those sorts of things a couple of years ago. But we've got to look at the big picture and say we've done a fantastic job. We can do better perhaps in cost, and I know there'll be commentators about that. But we've also got a great privilege that we work in this industry where we help members have better retirements, have more, a higher quality retirement, and without the early work done by, the Labor government back in the early 90s and 80s. And I see we're now moving into a new accord period, interestingly enough. Without the work coming out of that, $1.7 trillion. We've got a great industry. It provides great careers for us all. And I just thought it's time to reflect back on that with an attitude of gratitude, pardon the pun and the rhyme, but and look at the great things we've done, but also recognise we've left some on the table, we've left some behind, and we've got plenty more work to do before what I call this generation of guardians of super. I'd like to see the folks that have come through in the last 30 years and have done well, like myself, consider ourselves the guardians of super and see what more we can do for super and make it stronger and make it better, make it more resilient before our careers maybe slow down.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the broader amount. I think you mentioned 1.7 trillion. I think we're now at 2.7, almost $3 trillion.
2.7, is it?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I'll get my twos and my ones confused.
So
sorry.
we're an enormous industry, enormous impact to the economy now. It's become a really critical piece to the puzzle. I guess there's some questions around sort of its efficiency, and is it becoming maybe as an industry a bit too bloated, and that's sort of some of the pushback in terms of the merging of funds and trying to create efficiencies. How do you think about sort of the structure of the industry?
Look, there's no doubt we've got mergers and we've got to have mergers. And I was reading a fascinating paper recently from a foreign affairs magazine that spoke about one thing that's happening out of this COVID is that it will just speed up the rate of change. So all of the themes, all of the issues we were talking about for the last 5 years will just get sped up. So it is a tax incentivized social contract. So we contribute, we get a tax deduction, it's tax protected while it's invested, and at the moment it's tax free when it comes out. Whether that should be that way or not, it's another issue. But I don't think it'll remain that way. But it's still tax protected. My financial planner tells me it's still the best, and I look at it and can see it for myself. It's still the best way to accumulate your retirement savings. So with that in mind, we have to look to cost efficiency. Federal Treasury will always come up. I see it's come up in recently with Senator Andrew Bragg's book and other places. It'll always come up. It'll be an ongoing conversation, an ongoing debate to prove our value and for net member returns, but also look at the cost of the entire system. So mergers have to happen. Back to your question on structure, there'll still be room for niche players. Whether they will have to go back to an outsourcing secretariat type model. There are a lot of, whilst we talk about engagement, there are some sectors with members that are quite connected to their funds. I work across a lot of super funds, talk to a lot of super fund execs, super fund CEOs, CIOs, and they certainly believe that there's in certain probably industry cohorts. Interesting, the discussion that's come out recently about the risk of narrow cohorts or otherwise. I think there's pros and cons with that. But sure, there'll be mega funds, have to be mega funds, but we've got to see the cost dividend come through to the member. I'm not sure that is a direct relationship yet that we're seeing coming through, but that needs to come. Mm-hmm. And I know the politicians, Senator Hughes and others, are pretty keen for that to come. Quite rightly, the taxpayers giving up taxpayer dollars today, which could go towards hospitals and schools today, for a future retirement benefit. They want to get a return for their buck, bang for their buck.
You raised a couple of interesting areas there to take it. Let's maybe stick to the tax protected piece, right? In terms that there is this tax benefit that comes from super, and it could be allocated to other areas. The whole premise behind super is to provide an income in retirement for members. But is the actual super system still fit for purpose with the types of work that people are doing? We've got more gig economies, much more shorter term engagements, a lot of freelancers. So some of these structures around the tax benefits that come from super and the way that people have been employed is changing. So does super still, serve that purpose?
Yeah, look, I think you're touching on a couple of things there, Alex. There's clearly an area and there has been from day one with contractors and self-employed individuals, basically those that aren't employees, not qualifying for super guarantee. And we see numbers, and then with the gig economy and casualisation, which is going to be, I think, a big issue that'll come out of all these talks, these Accord-type talks happening in Canberra. There's more than 1 million, and I haven't looked at the APRA numbers for a while now, but there's well over 1 million in that category that aren't covered by SG. So they aren't getting the benefits, whether it's the tax contribution benefits or the long-term benefits from a better quality retirement that could come. They're not getting that. They're not participating. But is the tax, if your question is the tax benefit divided up with equity across various income bands? Yeah, look, I think that's another question that I'm not perfectly qualified to do, but it certainly seems that there's some pretty large accounts that would be attracting pretty large tax advantage. And I think we do have to say, if we're trying to get a certain income band more engaged in super, they certainly would want to feel that the not just the tax benefits, but the overall long-term saving benefits are skewed to their advantage. But look, there are others better qualified than that to answer that, probably, Alex.
Yeah, look, that's fine. I think more the question was around sort of the low end part of town, that people that don't earn a lot of money or gig economies, and supposedly the tax system is there designed to sort of encourage super, but in this current work environment, the super system doesn't really help them in that way. That was where I was trying to get at. Let's move let's move to some of the other points that you talked about in terms of the people that you deal with across the industry. And there is still a lot of players. The industry is getting larger. Talent is a big part of that. There's a lot of question marks around talent in Australia, and do we have the right sort of resources, particularly as a number of the funds are starting to move from this outsourced model to a in-source model. And so I wanted to get your thoughts, given your experience in the industry, as to how that's happening and the ability to also develop talent locally.
Well, look, it's interesting. I've been the beneficiary, my practice has been a beneficiary of insourcing of investments into large super funds. So I'll have to, in part talk my own book there. But to be quite frank, we're only following, a lot of that's been driven around cost. Every time I see a investment operations executive from one of the big super funds or a CIO from one of the big super funds get up and that they're insourcing, a large part of it's been about cost. Sure, they have to be competitive, and there might be issues about how and the big funds all have very professional and very good investment professionals sitting on their investment committees, making allocations and that. So I think the argument about how they're going to allocate to a team that might be underperforming internally versus a team externally, it's a competitive landscape, right? From returns and everything else and for their members, they're going to allocate to the right investment teams with the right risk profiles, etc. So I think so I wouldn't worry too much about that. The bigger trend of insourcing, if that's one of your points there, is that we're only following what the Dutch are doing, what the Americans, CalPERS, these guys have been doing it for decades. They've been running internal and external ones in parallel, and it's worked for them from what I can see from the work that happens overseas. So it's going to continue. And it'll have a cost measure, as it should have, and they have to remain. And while we've got a very open comparative system, if that's the right word, there's tables all the time. I do a bit of work in the Northern Hemisphere as well, sometimes bringing talent. To your point about bringing talent, I'll come back to your talent question now. Bringing talent from the Northern Hemisphere to Australia. I've done that for a number of funds, and sometimes that's what's required. So to further your point about talent, have we got the talent pool? Yes, we've got the talent pool largely in Australia. We often export some good talent overseas. Now, some of that might be coming back and settling. So the talent's there. There's always this argument about pay, but I've moved some senior investment professionals into super funds, and often it gets the time where, sure, they're at a point in their career, they might be in their 40s or 50s, and they're coming in as a CIO or coming in as a head of asset class, and they basically said, I've done well. Right? I've done well. I've been global. I've done well. And that's why they're attractive to the super fund, by the way. And I want to get involved and maybe give back a bit. I can still get paid okay, particularly now with super funds that are recognising they need to provide performance incentives for key areas. Not just in investments. I think they need to look at them outside that too, because it is a competitive market. And as these funds get big, and the commercial funds are here to stay, and they provide a great competitive tension to the industry funds. So look, the talent's here. We can grow it. We need to stop letting it bleed overseas. I'm a bit of a rugby fan, so I see the rugby talent guys going overseas for the big dollars. Look, we have a great 2.7, as you corrected me, 2.7, and that's doubling every 5 years, those funds. So, and if I could just extend that answer a little bit more, Alex, when I do consult overseas and do talk to CIOs of big DB, defined pension funds over there, they are in awe of our ongoing cash flows, compulsory contributions. We know from the work that Mercer surveys that we are, one of the best. I think it's top 3 pension funds, super funds in the world. So the Northern Hemisphere guys to get access to our cash flow and invest it, and now we're investing it in nation building assets. There's some tremendous opportunities there, and we should be very proud of it.
Mm-hmm. Look, it's a fascinating place. I was also wanted to just touch on before we move away from talent is how have you seen the mindset change? Because the model has changed from all this traditional sort of contracted, outsourced approach to internal management.
Yeah.
How do you look for different people? It's a very different skill to be able to sort of outsource versus the people who are actually managing money sort of hands on.
Yeah, good point. Good point. It's interesting. Whenever I get asked, and I had this a little while back now, but I remember being introduced to a fund a fund here in Sydney, although I do a lot of work in Melbourne and Brisbane too, where the big funds are, but they were looking for a new CIO. And the one question I asked them is, do you want an asset consultant or do you want an investor? And thankfully, they said they wanted a real markets investor. And I've got, nothing wrong with asset consultants have their place, but I think it's very different to just being an asset consultant and coming straight into a fund that is going to start to roll out a direct investment program. The complexity, you need great investment operations people. So the complexity is just enormous. And I think that's one thing that sort of, and to be fair, that's where great people like the governance around direct investment. And that's great people and great work like the Roger Irwins at Willis Towers Watson do globally. But to hire, I think in that leadership role, you need to hire that gravitas and that experience in markets, that experience running teams. And a CIO these days is runs people that runs money, and therefore runs people as well. So I don't know if I said that correctly, but and I wrote a piece actually in your magazine a few years back about the challenges of being a CIO. And it's particularly if you're in a super fund, you've got to communicate, you've got to do video pods, you've got to do road shows, you've got to have the people piece, the business strategy, as well as running your investment team. So it's I would say a CIO of a super fund's more complex in some of the pieces that they're doing that are well beyond just straight investment and managing investment teams. Sure, they don't have to go and pitch for money, and that's another thing that reminds me. The senior folks that are brought across to super fund world, they have enjoyed the fact that they're not out there pitching in asset management land to new clients for new money all the time. They actually get to spend more time on the business and on the investment side of things. So, look, horses for courses, Alex.
It's an incredible piece, actually, you just referred to, which is around the CIO and the changing role of the CIO. Because it's one of the questions that I've spoken to many of the asset owners as part of our advisory boards. Yeah, and a lot of them are talking about sort of the CIO role moving further and further away from touching money or asset allocation. And it's interesting, maybe I get two parts to your thoughts around the changing role of the CIO around moving to more of an operational communications role, or do we need to sort of, have another role that's a COO role that does a lot of the team and managing the team, and the CIO is really hands-on? How do you think about that piece?
Yeah, well, look, I think a few, you touch on a role that's called a business manager or an investments business manager, and a number of the big commercial asset managers, not so much super funds, but commercial asset managers. I can think of people like AMP and Colonial, what's First Sentier now, and other places, some of the big multi-assets ones. I think Macquarie have them too. So they've got lots of different, and those big commercial asset managers, when I consult there too a lot too, and they really run almost their some of them don't have pure CIOs, and some of them actually, where they might have the CIO role, is actually playing as much of a business role across various successful portfolio teams, because you've got to remember inside commercial asset managers now, each of those asset classes or asset teams or portfolio teams are all virtually sold individually as specialist teams with specialist products and investment solutions. So, the global small caps and all those things, so they're all sold. They're all so. It used to be the day, when I first started back in the late 80s, 90s, you were selling a balance fund. And in fact, you were selling a balance fund. I had a sales team that was selling balance funds to advisors and to super funds, right? That's all they bought back in 92. They bought deferred annuities and balance funds. So now that same team would be selling, various asset sleeves, as you know. So the CIO in those businesses does play as much of a business role as a house communicator, as a house bringing the house overall strategy and investment strategy together. So there's one way, but then each of those PM teams or asset strategy teams have to also be good communicators in their own right, out there doing their roadshows and selling as well too. So, but the bigger groups have business managers, and even some of the super funds. I think of one of the big super funds in New South Wales here in Sydney that has business and operations managers inside assisting the CIOs. So, yeah, look, they're in there. I still think there's room for the CIO in most super funds to have their hands on the strategy, have their hands on the policy. They're not running money themselves. They've got heads of asset classes who maybe not running money themselves either. They're running various teams.
It's funny. It's funny you say that though around sort of the CIOs not sort of doing the hands-on money piece, because I think if you ask the member on the street, and they say, okay, here's the CIO, what do you think the CIO does? They would think that the CIO is sort of allocating money to different pieces, taking all the information from all his team and doing that. So I was just sort of wondering, do we need to maybe even change that title of CIO? Maybe there's a head of investments and then there's some other operations piece. And
Oh yeah, look. I suppose it's a bit like what the CEO. I mean, maybe I'm being a bit glib when I say what the CIO does, but they're certainly running all those investment processes and investment decision-making processes, investment governance, reporting to investment committees. So, but are they on the Bloomberg every day? When I say running money, I mean on the Bloomberg every day and making stock or individual asset things. So, but yeah, look, I think it's the member may think that, but I think the member's got to recognise, and that's where, because they only see the CIO talking in their video pods and video casts and those sort of things. So they've got to remember, and it's hard, the super funds themselves only show key executive roles on their websites, and they don't realise that there's, a cast of a big cast of a team underneath that. And it's, and to your point, we've moved from the secretariat days of one investment manager sitting in a corporate fund or sitting in a small industry fund, choosing, requiring an asset consultant, I should say, to help them make their decisions. And the asset consultant of old was essentially the outsourced CIO. So we've moved a long way in that 20 years, to coming back to one of your earlier questions, Alex.
Mm-hmm. Let's change tact a little bit. We talked a lot about superannuation, the changing, type of the role in superannuation, to more sort of some of the dysfunction that we've seen with super. And I think some of that's come out with this early release scheme. People sort of questioning where's Canberra's motive, and should super be seen as effectively a piggy bank. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that piece of sort of...
Yeah. Oh, well, you brought me back to a recent book by a senator who's just launched it this week. Look, I've got to say that my view of super is a bit old school. Been around in it, as I say, almost 30 years. My view of super is it's pretty simple, and I think along the way we've got a bit too complicated. It is a tax social contract. Give up some tax today, or society gives up some tax today to fund retirement incomes for the future. It is members' money, yes, but it is only members' money when they retire. It used to be pretty simple like that. And I don't know why it can't be simple like that. As soon as you start to have a lot more, even the matter of choice, choice came in, I think it was mid-2000s. And whilst it allowed members to choose choice and sort of not be necessarily they were auto-enrolled they still are auto-enrolled, but then to get up and move that money to another fund, that triggered a lot of commercial super fund managers and in turn industry fund managers to create a whole lot of funds and sub-funds and we have a whole lot of complexity today off the back of what I would say was, well-intentioned choice, allowing member competition, etc., and supposedly putting more competition into the system. But we've got a lot of complexity. And what comes with the complexity? A lot of cost. And so it's kind of interesting. You've got unintended consequences from the Howard government, 2006, 2005, around that time for choice, coming full circle 15 years later, where you've got a new Liberal senator, Andrew Bragg, complaining about cost when it was the Liberals that really indirectly, brought in that cost. So certainly going back to my early days, I said earlier in 92, industry funds buying deferred annuities and balance funds, pretty simple. Now, okay, perhaps the cost has to come down and that will be an internal debate with either side of government. And that's where the industry's got to come to grips with that cost. It's become complex, products have become complex. And the commercial side, CEOs on the commercial side recognise that. So cost is the biggie, and bang for the buck. And it's whilst we and we have to be fair to Mr. Bragg, Senator Bragg, he did talk about the overall tax deductions. I think I saw in an AFR piece during the week, the overall tax deductions and the overall cost. So if those numbers are accurate, then we do have to really look at the value and the efficacy of the whole system. But I'm not sure that one of his other premises was that members' money, it becomes an emergency ATM. That's not where super's meant to be. We have to find other ways to fund these emergencies. That super could pivot, to use the term of the time, and be agile and support people great and in their time of need. But and I'm not going to go into who needed the money and who didn't need the money. But I think if we continue to dilute super's mission or super's purpose, which I see as purely retirement incomes and nothing else, because that's what the long-term social contract's about, then we do chip away at its at the solidarity we have, and it does mean people have lower balances in the future. And I know it's a 1 in 100 year, so we're told 1 in 100 year, and we should be looking after people now. Great, we've done that. But now we've got to have a better way of managing this, because we're talking about having a housing savings plan. We're talking about we want to be a nation builder. So we're going to buy illiquid assets. All this hoo-ha about illiquid assets. We've got to have illiquid assets. We've got to be funding infrastructure. We've got to be a nation builder. Great. But then we can't also be an emergency ATM, can we?
Oh, look, it's an incredible issue where super's become this political football. And I sort of, in my discussions around the early release, no funds were consulted first, and it seems as though even the industry associations weren't consulted.
No, they were told. I know for a fact they were told.
So, that brings us to another very interesting question. We've got a whole lot of industry bodies, IFA, ASFA, FSC, that are out there. They seem to not have the power in Canberra. The banking sector has very strong associations that push for them, business, miners. Is there just a problem that maybe there's just too many associations floating around, and so there's no clear voice to sort of represent super despite its size?
Yeah, well, as in this article that I'll be finishing up for you on the weekend, Alex. Disunity is death, or to be more positively, unity is strength. And it may be hard to do, but we've got to do it until we have one strong association with one strong vision that is about net member benefits, members having a better quality of life in retirement than just purely the age pension, which has to come under pressure. So until we have one association, to your point, the miners get better results. The business has big business, and there's a couple of business associations, but they are very focused on their constituency. We have essentially one constituency, superannuation members, represented by three big ones that you pointed out: FSC, ASFA, ISA. There are smaller ones. There are multiple think tanks. There's a Super Consumers Association, which I didn't know existed until recently. And then it's interesting in the framework that you mentioned earlier of super funds merging. So if that's the paradigm of super funds merging rapidly over the next 5 years, then surely the industry association has to merge too. It's good for the goose, good for the gander. And with that one focal point, that one strength, we can get ahead of this political football that is super. What do they say? Don't get in the way of a big pot of money. Don't put a politician in between a big pot of money, around a big pot of money. We need to get ahead of these, get ahead of the agenda. We need to create the agenda. We have brilliant people who write brilliant reports and do brilliant work, the David Knoxes, the Michael Rices. And where do these, I just don't see that these things get taken up fast enough. Well, not fast enough for my liking. And with one association representing us in a real politic way, in a smart, clever way, then we can do a lot. And that would really tap off the fact that, I see super as, we need to get super to the same level as Medicare, where if you touch Medicare, you get your fingers chopped off, right? As a politician, don't touch Medicare. Well, we need to get super to that level. You touch super, we're coming after you.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the other thing that's I think part of the distraction is sort of this war that was happening between industry funds and retail funds, and that's sort of been this clear distraction.
Well, if we had one association, Alex, we wouldn't have these interfamily, internecine feuds. We have more that binds us than what divides us. Yep. If we're all focused on member purpose, then what binds us together is far greater than what divides us apart. So it may be hard to do, but until we get that sorted, one association, then we get on to this purpose for what super's about, which I've been banging on about, apologies. And then we can start to do some other things like coverage for the people that aren't covered, the over 1 million we mentioned earlier. There's a lot to be done. And I'd like to be part of what I call the first generation of super guardians, that we can do a lot more, because we've got a lot to be proud of, but we can do it better. And we can therefore put to one side this political stuff that the politicians come at, and we can be ahead of them.
Last question then, in terms of this guardianship, do we then need some sort of a DNA that represents super? Do we need to reframe that, or is the existing system still okay?
Yeah, well, look, I suppose it's been, to your point, it comes back to coming together. Super's developed down the industry fund route, and that you might call that one tribe, and it's developed down the commercial route. And the commercial route's really kicked on since Choice. And that's been fine. But both sides have added cost, because one wants to keep up with the other and keep up with the Joneses. But, we do need to set aside this tribal DNA and have one national or supranational DNA. And our DNA should simply be, we're here for our members. If our members, and that should feed through to what I'd love to see is some sort of superannuation. Once we get the super association organised, then we can get, have some agreement on the purpose of super, and get that hammered through with legislation and regulation and enacted, and then we can get to these other problems. It all comes back to one association, and but I'd like to see some sort of superannuation ombudsman or commission that is an expert panel, takes submissions from stakeholders about what needs to change, and it's done in an expert way. Not just a parliamentary committee, which isn't stacked with experts. An expert panel that then can review all the regulation and see if there's a net member benefit to some of this regulation we've got. We are hugely regulated. Some would say hugely over-regulated. But, regulation comes about because industries can't self-regulate sometimes, and if we wish to reduce the level of regulation, we need to ensure we can really well self-regulate and look after ourselves. That will be a lot better if we had one association to one of your points earlier about member engagement, I think we came across it, is think what we could do with public education, a great public education campaign to turn super into that Medicare, what I call national institution. We need a huge public education program from schools all the way up, so that when you're going into work at 16 as a part-time student, a part-time worker, full-time student, you know that super means something. It's going to do something for me. And we may add on a home savings plan to it on top, not as part of the retirement piece. SG should always be for retirement. And I disagree with Andrew Bragg there, if that's his point about trying to chip away at SG and divert that into housing. SG is for super. You can add on something for housing. And I know Singapore has a national multi-fund that adds in housing and I think health as well as retirement. But it's in addition. We can't chip away at our retirement. We're only the first generation in. We'll get it right and we'll get the cost down but we've got a lot to be proud of the first 30 years, what it could be in the next 30 years if we had one association really rowing all together.
All right, that's been fantastic food for thought there, Michael. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for listening, and thanks very much. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us. All views expressed on this podcast are subject to change and do not necessarily reflect the views of Conexus Financial. This podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be relied upon as investment advice.